This is Doug from Dynamic Computing, and welcome to episode 53 of 10-Minute Amiga Retrocast. This week I've got a very special episode, and this is all about dispelling the rumors about the popularity of the Commodore Amiga in North America. As an extra special bonus, I've got as a guest Eric, also known as Intricate from Amigalove. A month or two back, Neil from the Retro Man Cave did a great episode on the Amiga in North America from a European, United Kingdom point of view. As special guests, he had Amiga Bill from the Guru Meditation, he had Bode and Aaron from the Amigos podcast, and he had Ravi from the Retro Hour podcast. It was a great episode, they did a great job, but there were a lot of things that were missed in that episode, including several important points that Eric and I hope to clear up for you. Let's just get one thing straight though. The European market was absolutely critical for Commodore in the early to mid 90s. There's no doubt about that, and you'll never hear an argument from me about that. Many Amigas were sold in those markets, many of them to gamers, lots of Amiga 500, 600s, and 1200s. But the Amiga story does not begin in 1991 when that market started taking off. And that seems to be what a lot of people think. Dozens and dozens of times I've heard the old trope, the Amiga was never popular in North America and the United States. Nobody knew what it was in North America and the United States. And absolutely nothing could be further from the truth. Absolutely nothing. And the truth is, hundreds of thousands of us, if not millions of us, were happily using our Amigas in the late 80s and early 90s, while the Europeans were still using their ZX Spectrums to load up a copy of Horace Goes to Sunday School on audio tape. The computer market in the United States has always been different than the computer market in the European countries, maybe up until the last 10-15 years. We started adopting the Commodore PET in the late 70s and the Apple II in the late 70s. We jumped right on board the VIC-20 in 1980 and used that happily for years. We started jumping right into the Commodore 64 in 1982. And while we did enjoy our Commodore 64 as a game machine, there's no denying we enjoyed it as a game machine. It was a productivity tool for millions. Word processing, basic spreadsheets, running businesses on it, handling databases. We were fine with that on our Commodore 64s in the early to mid 80s. By 1983 and 1984, we were throwing our data sets out the window and getting our nice 1540 drives, nice 1541 drives. Something that was far less common in the European countries. By the time 1986 rolled around, a lot of us were already considering ditching our 8-bit computers for these bright, shiny, new 16-bit computers like the Macintosh, like the PC-AT, like the Amiga that were coming down the pipeline. Compare that with Europe in 1986, where the Commodore 64 was just starting to catch on. Things were different, and it always seemed like Europe was just a couple years behind us as far as supporting technology and bringing it into their homes and businesses. Now, the Amiga came out in 1985 in the United States to some pretty fantastic fanfare. The price was actually very aggressive when you compared it to a PC-AT or a Macintosh. It was $1,000, $1,500 less, and it was substantially more powerful. Like many other kids my age at the time, we drooled over the Amiga. We wanted the Amiga, but the $1,300 price tag was still out of our price range. But by late 86 and early 87, there were already rumors of new, lower-priced Amigas coming down the pipeline, getting ready to ship soon. So that's when a lot of us really struck and went for it. And believe me, in the mid to late 80s, we Americans knew all about the Amiga. There were magazines coming out our ears. We've got awesome magazines like Amazing Computing, Amiga World. These are just a few samples of some of the magazines that I have from the period of time. In 1986 and 1987, there were many, many Amiga magazines. The Amiga World I just showed you, the .info, Amazing Computing. There was an Ahoy Amiga version. There was Compute's Gazette that started concentrating really heavily on the Amiga. And you could walk into almost any drugstore and pick up these Amiga magazines without any issue at all, right here in North America in 1987. And these magazines were quite different from their European counterparts. Instead of concentrating on maybe 80% video games like some of the European magazines started doing in the early 90s, this was all about productivity software. This was all about creative software, creative hardware. Here's a whole article on Genlocks, just a random page that I turned to in Amiga World. This is the 1989 version. Here's a list of a bunch of vendors, a bunch of pieces of hardware. This kind of stuff was just common in the mid to late 80s for us. Our Amiga magazines were all about awesome hardware add-ons, awesome productivity software, awesome creative software, and the tutorials on how to use them and how to integrate them into even your business without any issues at all. Now, we did have games. Of course we had Amiga games. We loved our Amiga games. But the magazines, maybe 10-15% of their content was set aside for Amiga entertainment. The other 85%, we were all about creativity and productivity. Let's spend just a couple of minutes looking at one of the popular Amiga magazines. They came out with a yearly guide. This is from Amazing Computing. It is the Spring-Summer 1990 Amiga Guide with 560 vendors, 2,700 products, 240 users groups, all about North America and the United States. We'll start out here with Amazing Computing's list of Amiga dealers. Now, these are just dealers that sold their Amazing Computing magazine. There were lots more Amiga dealers that didn't, but you can see in the United States there were hundreds of dealers. And the users groups in the United States, almost every town already had a Commodore users group, along with at least 10 or 20 BBSs you could phone up to interact with other Commodore users. Many of these C64 groups expanded to become Amiga groups. I remember in 1998 in Rockford, we had dozens of people who brought their Amiga to the Rockford users group. And there was always a few holdouts there who swore the Amiga was no more powerful than a C64 running GEOS. The United States and Canada had hundreds of users groups, absolutely hundreds of users groups. Well, I'll be. Look at this user group called WOG in White Plains, New York, run by some guy named Billy Winters. Wonder whatever happened to that Billy Winters guy. Now, how about Amiga availability in the United States? We're a huge country over here as far as land mass. You can literally drive from one side of one of our states to the other side of one of our states. It takes 10 hours to drive. We're huge. So what happens in New York is different than what happens in Chicago, and that's different than what happens in Los Angeles. We'll use my hometown as example. I lived in Rockford, Illinois for most of my early life and all of my Amiga days. We had 140,000 people in town. Not a huge town, okay? Within a 30 or 45-minute drive, there were 6 Amiga dealers. Just 140,000 people, 6 dealers that sold Amiga products. And if I wanted to buy Amiga software, there's probably 10 within 45 minutes. Hour and a half drive up to Chicago, a couple dozen more up there. No problem at all. Availability, not an issue. And how about software availability? No problem at all. You could go into your local game store and buy it. You could go into your local Kmart or store like that, find Amiga software, no problems at all. And of course there was mail order, tons of mail order. America, the United States, had a ton of software vendors. Think of people like Electronic Arts, ASDIG, SSI, Broderbund, Gold Disc, Activision, Epix, and dozens more. All of these were Amiga vendors, and all of them were American companies. Even up until the early 90s, Electronic Arts stated that Amiga was their second best-selling platform behind the PC. That says something right there, and that's North America. How about hardware? Third-party hardware was really, really a hot commodity for the Amiga back in the day. Accelerator boards, RAM boards, gen locks, memory expansion, RTG graphics cards. Ever heard of GVP or ICD or Supra? Oh, New Tech, that's maybe a name you've heard. DKB, CSA, Microbotics. Just a few of our popular Amiga hardware vendors out of the dozens that there were. And guess what? They were all in North America. A lot of them, some in Canada, most of them in the United States. Very popular, and they're household names, even to this day, for the Amiga community. We've heard those names. All American companies. Now, I suspect that in, say, 1989 in Europe, maybe there was 1, 2, maybe 3 hardware vendors that actually made hardware for the Amiga computers. And that's in all of Europe. I wouldn't doubt that a bit. That does not sound like a failed product that nobody has heard of, does it? America also sold far more big box Amigas than ever sold in Europe. The A2000, A2500, A3000, A4000, all of them were fairly popular over here. Not necessarily for mom and pop home user, but for businesses, for things like that. What helped sell that? The video toaster came out, was announced in the late 80s and was popular for a decade after that. It was huge. The video toaster was huge. People who didn't even know what an Amiga was had heard of the video toaster. Local television network stations started picking them up and using them to replace machines that had formerly cost them hundreds of thousands of dollars. An entire submarket appeared. Magazines, video series on VHS tape, newsletters, hardware vendors, software vendors, all centered around the video toaster and this new desktop video technology that had come about. There was nothing else that could match it in its price range, and it helped sell hundreds of thousands of big box Amigas. I still had clients using the Video Toaster 4000 on a daily basis until 2005, and then I bought their Amigas. Now, the video toaster craze and the desktop video craze was never as big in Europe, and the video toaster never really had a PAL version, so big box Amigas were far less common over there. The Amiga was big over here in the United States and North America. In many ways, it was as popular as the Macintosh for a period of time. Many of us used our Amigas on into the early 90s, and still things like the 386 and Windows 3.1 and the new Macintoshes started catching our eye and showing us that, yeah, they were as powerful, maybe a little more than the Amiga. And we started drifting away about that time. That would be about 1991, just about the time that the Amiga started really catching on in Europe. How about that? See a pattern here? From 1982 to 1986, we were happily banging away on our Commodore 64s. Then around 86 or 87, they started really catching on in Europe. Then from 1985 to 1991, here are we Americans happily banging away on our Amigas. And about the time that we're starting to drift away, they start catching on and becoming more popular in Europe. Please, please understand that there is nothing wrong with this at all. Nothing wrong with it. It's okay that Europe started using these really powerful and beautiful machines years after we did. That's okay. What's not okay is thinking that North America never had a huge Amiga following. But enough of my yammering. Let's hear from our friend Eric Intricate from Amigalove and see what he has to say about it. Take it away, Eric.
Hey guys, it's Intricate from Amigalove.com. I want to give a huge shout out to Doug for giving me a chance to have this conversation. It's a little bit difficult to talk about. I have a lot of friends around the world who I truly consider dear friends. I did want to at least address this misconception that the Amiga wasn't hugely admired, beloved in North America, in both the United States and Canada. Now, again, I'm not trying to step on any toes, but the Amiga was invented here. It was acquired by Commodore in the United States. Now, at that time, there were really two main design houses when it came to engineering. There was obviously Pennsylvania, Westchester, and then there was Germany. And those two teams collaborated on a lot of hardware, of course, back to the 8-bit days. So there was already a history of an international team, right? Now, by 1992, that's when the Amiga 1200 came out. By then, Commodore was in deep crap, shall we say. They were already bleeding money, shedding jobs, and they were fading from the marketplace when the 1200 showed up. In the United States, most folks had already moved on. That is 100% true. Prior to 1992, actually it was probably more like 1991, from about 1985 to 91, the Amiga was a viable platform, and it had a lot of users in the United States, in major cities mostly, and especially the big boxes. In professional settings, you'll sometimes see people say, gosh, that's unobtainium where I live. You can never find an Amiga 1000, or you can never find an Amiga 3000. Well, you can find them in the United States because people bought them. And there was actually a user base here of professionals with cash who were not just into games. They were not considered consoles. They were considered serious machines that got creative work done, really great creative work done. And there was a huge scene for that. All you have to do is hop over to YouTube and do a search for Ami Expo, whether it be like the ones in New York, and just see how they were filled with excited, intelligent people, creative people who wanted to support this platform, who loved this platform, who were somewhat angry with Commodore with how it was playing out. Now, I've thought about this for a long time, and I've actually done a lot of research on this topic, and I plan on publishing a few of my own videos about this very topic, but I wanted to at least put this idea out there preemptively. One of the greatest adventure games of all time, across the board, including for PC folk, is Indiana Jones' Fate of Atlantis.
Now that game came out in 1992, 5 months before the 1200 was released in October of that same year. And in my opinion, right as Commodore was about to give its last gasp with the 1200 and the CD32. They had one last gasp in them, but that truly was mostly in Europe at that point. When Indiana Jones came out in 1992, it was heralded as one of the greatest games of all time. In 1993, LucasArts cut an extended version.
You could only get it on Mac and PC. Why? Because it was CD-ROM. Now, the CD-ROM and Commodore, the strategy, or I should say the complete lack of a viable strategy of how to adopt the CD-ROM into the Amiga universe, is one of the biggest failures Commodore ever made. And it's, in my opinion, one of the main reasons why they died. People have talked about the leadership and the people that ran Commodore and the greed and all of that, and there's plenty to be told there. But one of the biggest failures they ever made was their lack of integration of CD-ROM technology into their long-term plan. Now, they created an Amiga 500 add-on, which was a train wreck. Which is a shame, because basically when they released that CD-ROM for the 500 was discontinued at the same time. And it was like, wait, what? I'm going to go spend how many hundreds of dollars for this thing for my machine that you just told everyone publicly we're not going to support anymore? What game company is going to try and create CDs for that? Not very many. At the same time, you're rolling out the CD-TV, which is essentially a 500 with a built-in CD-ROM. That was insanely expensive. And a lot of people at that time were not willing to shell out that kind of coin for an unproven platform with CDs, okay? They just weren't. Meanwhile, Lucasfilm, which is what they were called at that time, they're starting to move their creative onto the CD format because it could hold so much more, and Amigas were stuck in floppy drives. They were still stuck with, that's how you would buy your games at the stores. The companies that really had a lot of creative to sell were, and wanted to use they wanted to use video, they wanted to use actual voice. They were starting to finally, or I shouldn't say finally, they were starting to migrate over to the CD-ROM platform because they could see with PCs, CD players, even though they were still not cheap, they were half the cost of what they ran for the Amiga, because the Amiga was a SCSI-based system, and there's nothing wrong with that. In fact, I would argue the SCSI systems are faster and they're more stable. But CD-ROM technology on SCSIs were twice as much. Well, no one's buying that. Most average people are not going to be able to afford a CD player SCSI-based for an Amiga because it was twice as much as what the PCs cost. That is essentially what made a lot of folks in America who saw the games on the shelves that were enhanced, that were starting to move into that direction, and that was very exciting. Well, would you rather buy a SCSI player, a SCSI CD-ROM player right here, or would you rather spend a little bit more and get an entire PC clone with a CD player with it? What would you do? Well, you would do what everybody else did. If you lived here at that time, you would buy the cheap PC clone, and it rips my heart out of my chest talking like this, but that was one of the main drivers. That, and the fact that by the time the 1200 came out, it couldn't even play, do we have to say the word? It's almost like a four-letter word in the Amiga realm. 1200 couldn't play Doom, and there was no way to fix it. You couldn't just fix it. With a PC, you could scrape off the knuckles of your hands and play with cards inside of horrible, ugly towers, but you could get Doom to work, and it could play really, really well. And that ship had sailed, you guys. On top of all that, back in 1989 through 1991, two huge pieces of tech hit the gaming community in North America: the Sega Genesis and the Super Nintendo. 1991. This is before the Amiga 1200 came out. It cost far less here than an Amiga. Europe did not have the Super Nintendo yet. We did. If you're a kid and all you really cared about was playing games, right? What do you think wound up underneath Christmas trees and in birthday presents? Those consoles did. And all you had to do, guys, was use your eyeballs. People want to talk about AGA chipsets. Look, the AGA chipset was great, but it didn't even compete with consoles that were older than it. So if you wanted to play platforms, you want to play a platformer, you're not going to go to an Amiga to play that, and you're not even going to do it in 2020 unless you're just really, really nostalgic for it, or someone's created a brand new one who's incredibly talented, because the vast majority of platformer games look and play 5 times better on those consoles than they do the Amigas. They just do. That's the way it was. And that's kind of how it played out in this country. It kills me to say that, but it's absolutely what happened. No one's going to go get a $500 or $600 Amiga when they can just go into the store and buy a Super Nintendo for $200 and play Super Mario or whatever. Look, the Super Nintendo even got Doom. By the time the 1200 came out, most Americans had already said sayonara because they couldn't keep up with the Joneses, and everyone wants to keep up with the Joneses next door. And when you go over to someone's house, that's what the Amiga used to be. Used to be people would come over to you say you have an Amiga 500 at home, and everyone else had Commodore 64s, which I grew up on and I adore. I adore my 64. People are coming over with Apple IIs, people are coming over even with, well, let's be honest, the PC in 1985 was a piece of crap. It was awful. It was not user-friendly. It was geared entirely towards businesses, and why businesses thought that it was good, I still don't really understand, but they did, and they bought them, and they were not cheap back then either. In 1986, a PC clone here in the United States would cost you about $1,300 US, just double that, and a little bit more, and that's going to be today's dollars. That was a lot of money. It was a lot of money for a machine that you were like, wow, it does black and white text really well. Interesting. In any case, in 1985 and 1986, when people saw Amigas, they wanted to go over to those kids' houses. Like, holy smoke, they've got something that is from the future. It felt like something from the future. Commodore sat on that stuff, you guys. They made a valiant upgrade with the 500 and 2000. There's no denying those two machines, those were fantastic upgrades compared to the 1000, absolutely. And they sold well. They sold millions of 500s in this country, and they sold a pretty healthy amount of 2000s for those that could afford them. 1990 rolls around and the 3000 comes out. Some would argue underpowered. It was still an upgrade though. Compared to the 2000, it was more than double. And if you got the 25 megahertz, it was fantastic. And that's when things started to look like, okay, they've got a plan for the future, but they were already starting to slip. You see, for the price that you paid for a 3000, and as beautiful as those machines were, there were machines by Apple that same year that were shipping. Now, they were expensive, but they were starting to ship with CD-ROMs. You see, they had a plan for the future. Even if they knew most of their customers couldn't afford it, Apple was like, this has to be part of our desktop strategy. And unfortunately, by 1992, they're shipping brand new, cost-reduced Amiga 1200s that should have been shipped in 1989 and 1990. They were way too late. They should have shipped the AGA chipset in 1989, not 19... Look, I know it only sounds like 3 years, and coming from Commodore 64, where we sat on that sucker for 10 years, we're like, what's the big rush? Back then, every year, it was an order of magnitude how fast things were changing. And unfortunately, Commodore was asleep at the wheel. They had a fantastic plan to make some money in Europe at the time, but it was not a long-term strategy for success. And within 2 years, even with that success and all of the folks that bought 1200s in Europe, it still collapsed in on itself. It just did. Their desktop strategy was a joke by that point, and it couldn't compete, and that's kind of where we are. But trust me when I say this, and I'll wrap this up. Boy, that was a lot. I'm sorry. But in 1985, Amiga did take the world by storm here. For those that could afford it, and there were a lot, the Amiga was a big deal. And professionals, really, really lucky kids, college students, it was a really big deal. I'll leave it with this, and I'm not going to use names, but one of my dear friends here in Seattle was on an Atari and he had just bought it, and within the year, and it was a top of the line Atari model. I don't remember the number, but in any case, within actually just a few months, the Amiga 1000 came out, and he worked in retail in a technology store. And when he saw that, he instantly sold his Atari and purchased the Amiga 1000. And he was a huge fan and continued to buy hardware up until the early 90s, when the writing was on the wall for him too, and he moved over to Macintosh. That was the direction he took, even though he had money. Even though he had money to invest further into Amiga, by then it was obvious to him and to those around him in the United States that the Amiga strategy was failing. And he moved to the Macintosh and pretty much stuck with that for years, and ultimately you know, like everybody, you start to buy a little bit of everything at some point in time. And so that's just kind of how it went down. Anyway, Doug, this has been fun. I really appreciate the time. Good luck editing that, because wow, 10 mark, right? You really need to just add a 0. If you add a 0 to your logo, holy smoke. Yeah, I think 100 marks probably. That sounds pretty sweet too. All right. Anyway, this is Eric from Seattle, and we'll talk to you next time. Bye-bye.
That just about brings tears to this old man's eyes. Thank you, Eric. That was very, very insightful, and I appreciate it. I understand that there's a misconception about the Amiga's popularity in the United States. I totally get it. A lot of people in the Amiga community now are younger than me. I'm turning 50 years old this year. I mean, I know I look like a young man in my early 20s, but yeah, I'm going to be 50 this year. A lot of you out there are in your late 30s, early 40s, and you're just too young to remember the Amiga was popular in the United States before it really got big in Europe. You grew up in a time where, hey, Amigas, hey, they're all over the place. It's 1992. Hey, AGA Amigas are coming out. That's when you saw it. That's what you visually saw. You never sat back there when you were 10, 12, 13 years old and said, huh, where did this Amiga come from? Was it popular in the United States? It was. So we old geezers just need to set the record straight. The Amiga was well known, the Amiga was well loved, and the Amiga was well used in North America in the mid-80s to early 90s. It had a wonderful and glorious second wind in Europe from about 1991 to about 1995, maybe even 1996, and I am happy about that. By that time, many of us Amigans in the United States had packed up our Amigas and Commodore 64s and just delegated them to the fond memory bin. Now get off my lawn, you whippersnappers. For a great American perspective on the Amiga community and the Amiga in the United States, be sure you watch the Viva Amiga documentary that I covered in a review last year. I'll link to it in the description, but it really talks a lot about the Amiga in the United States. I also get that this video will cause some controversy. Eric and I fully acknowledge that. But understand, this video was made with love. Amigalove, to be exact. We just wanted to get the truth out there. The Commodore machines and the Amiga machines were incredibly popular in the United States in the mid to early 90s. That is a fact. We had hundreds of Amiga vendors selling Amigas. We had hundreds of software vendors. We had dozens and dozens and dozens of third-party hardware manufacturers. We had almost 250 Amiga and Commodore users groups. That says a lot right there. The Commodore machines and Amiga machines were very popular in North America just a couple years earlier than they were over in Europe. Now you know. I would like to thank my wonderful Patreons for supporting me. Everything that they give goes directly back into the show, and I really appreciate that. If you're interested in becoming a patron, here's the link for my Patreon page. Please go ahead, throw a couple bucks my way. I'd love it. But here is my beautiful Amiga 1000 from 1985, thanking my patrons in person.
I would like to thank my wonderful patrons, Reagan Orlando, Cameron Armstrong, Marco Rolep, Richard Shears, Retro Recollections, Kier Chrisman, Kevin Swartz, Gordon Hagan, Commodore Kid, Arcadius Kwasny, Lil Guy Pete Morgan, Robert Diggo, Steve Jones, and Alex Cheney. You guys are awesome. Sorry if the Amiga mispronounced your names.
But until next time, this is Doug from 10-Minute Amiga Retrocast and Eric from Amigalove, signing out.